Welcome back. Just before the break, we were talking about how muslin was grown and spun around the Gangetic plain and the Gangetic delta, and again somewhere in Bangladesh near Meghna, some 40 kilometers or 40 miles region. We have the expert in our studios, and he will take us through the journey of the development and the history of muslin. Saif.
Yes, please.
Where would you like to start the journey?
Well,
back 300 years ago, or
we could
further down?
We could actually have a quick look at some of these photographs over here. The interesting part about it is that this is the...
Can we focus on this picture, please?
This particular picture is an original newsprint, and if anybody can see it over here, it says the Illustrated London News, and this is a particular page from that newspaper, and the date over here is October 20th, 1855. So this, yes, it is part of that time when muslin was beginning to make a huge impact across English society. And previous to this, muslin was well known in the courts, amongst the royalty.
When you say English society, why not in Europe? Because the Dutch were involved also in exploiting on our shores.
Absolutely right, they were. However, it must be remembered that there was such an entity known as the Dutch East India Company. There's also a French East India Company. As a matter of fact, there were 7 East India Companies. All were defeated by the British, and eventually it was the English, that's the East India Company, which prevailed. And what they did, they took over the sole rights and resold muslin to these countries. So in a sense, the maximum onus of trade and the maximum profitability was through this East India Company. The other East India Companies gradually folded up, the last being the French, which folded up. And as this trade became significant, as a matter of fact, during the late 1770s, it represented about almost, for a period of 2 to 3 years, 70% of the profit of that company.
How much was that in sum of money, or pound sterling or something?
Well, in a particular year, it went up to in the region of about 25 to 30 million pounds during that particular time, which in today's value, and if I take the calculation from, for example, William Dalrymple, who's done this, it stands in the region of almost about 220, 250 million pounds. That's a huge sum of money which used to pour into this province of Bengal, and that is the reason why Bengal was the richest province in the whole, you could say, Mughals, protectorates amongst the empire. Yes, absolutely. And the story obviously drastically changed by the end of the colonial era. Now, as this fabric became popular through especially an exhibition that was held at Crystal Palace over there, and that was part of a design to show how the empire had so many crafts under it. This particular fabric, its process was shown in order to demystify, how it was woven and how it was done. It actually... Is
it factual or just...
It's quite factual. It's quite factual. I must say one thing. If there's any one good thing that came out of the English rule, it's the documentation. Because they were superb at documenting. They were probably equally good at exploiting, but they were superb at this documenting. And it is quite factual in that. So these newspapers in those days, this is just a few years before internet. So, so they detailed it.
Is there an illustration of that plant called Phuti-Karpas?
There is actually, and the Phuti-Karpas, this is a book that I had the privilege of writing and publishing. This is Muslin, Our Story, and there's a terracotta image over here of a weaver. So you can see that the weaver is sitting at the loom over here, and this is the only one of the rare examples that you have of weaving that happened in East Bengal.
Great experts of weaving.
Absolutely.
And the looms must be very delicate.
They were. And this is an example of the plant that you have mentioned. Now, again, one of the ironies is that the plant disappeared about 180 years ago.
Could you just show it to us, the camera, please?
Certainly.
Yeah. And this plant is known as putti karpas?
This plant is known as putti karpas in Bangla, and in English it's Gossypium arboreum neglecta, never mind the scientific name. And these particular samples are actually kept in Kew Gardens. So we went to the herbarium over there, and these are samples which are taken at that particular time. Because the English tried to replicate this plant in other parts of India and across the world, but it died out, and they realized that the plant was unique to the Meghna.
So this plant does not exist?
No, no, it does not exist anymore as far as is known, because it was a cultivated plant.
Right.
It wasn't a wild plant. There are varieties of cotton that exist because they are wild, but this was a cultivated variety, so it doesn't exist. And our efforts, which I'll come to in a bit more detail, are towards the revival as close as possible to this plant.
And how much have we succeeded in that?
Well, to step back a little bit, I think through DRIC, through the project of Bengal muslin, we are continuously trying to move forward on three fronts. One front is to establish that this particular product was a part of our country, was a heritage that was developed and taken to its almost highest peaks by our craftspeople, and they shouldn't remain anonymous, faceless and so on. We should recognize that, because at the end of the day, I am just a purveyor of that story, right? But they are the true heroes of that story. So these are the people, and it's important that we don't lose this story in this nebulous way that people sometimes treat it as an Indian fabric or an Asian fabric. No, it's a Bangladeshi fabric, if we want to be specific. It came from the parts which is Dhaka primarily, but it also was produced in a few of the parts even as far as Mymensingh, I say as far or as near, what you want to say, Mymensingh and so on, where some of the finest examples were created. So getting the story right is important.
True.
And I think that by doing that, you can have a story which I would suggest that other cultures, other nations would love to have. Muslin is a word which is even today, and we were just talking with someone before we entered the studio who said that his child uses muslin because it's used even today, and people even today associate it with luxury, with fineness. Unfortunately, most examples today are imitations because that plant doesn't exist, and therefore people get confused with anything light and airy. And I keep saying muslin was white, light and transparent, but everything white, light and transparent isn't muslin. So one has to understand that, but trying to get the story right, trying to revive our ownership to some extent, our connection, let's say, with this fabric is important, because while there are many reasons with which Bangladesh is associated with garments or these factories and so on, there are other textiles with which we are associated, which are a global brand. Because muslin had about 26 names in Chinese language, had about more than 30 in Turkish, was used in Indonesia, was used in Rome, of course, who are some of the biggest customers, used in Germany. One of the finest examples of that is even today used by the Japanese for their kimonos and night dresses and so on. So it was a global brand.
But when you say today they're being used, so they're not the same muslin,
No.
not the same quality.
No.
And you say they have different names for muslin.
That's right.
So that means they have different qualities of muslin.
They certainly do. And again, as I say, it ranges, that whole spectrum today of muslin ranges from what I would say the closest to muslin, which is a high count cotton fabric, and that high count must be something above a certain number. I don't want to confuse the viewers, but for example, the normal clothes that we wear are about 60, 70 count. There's such a thing known as count. And in muslin, the higher you go in count, the more finer
an
you are.
ignorant person like me, what is this count? Are we talking about the knots that we have for the carpets, one knot?
The count is the weight of the thread of a particular length. So if the weight is lower, the count becomes higher. So therefore, a certain length of yarn is known as count. And this is pretty common in the textile industry. So normally we use clothing of about 60, 70 count. Our bed sheets you'll see sold in some of the high-end shops, they say this is 300 count or 600 count. That means it's higher, getting higher. But those are all mill ones. This is handloom product and of a special cotton. So it just used to begin from something like 250 count and go up higher. And that was the difference that it made over there. The count would be higher. So it is this particular fabric which accounts for it. Now, you asked the question about imitations or what is happening in the market today. People have moved away even from cotton as a basic product, which I would say is really getting now into completely non-muslin field. So you would be able to actually see silk being used as muslin or organza being used, which is a synthetic product. I would suggest if you find something which is cotton, which is handloom, and which is above, let's say, 250 to 300 count, you would say this is the closest that I have to muslin. But today you get even those. China, without being too specific, sells more than 120 varieties of muslin, and that is very far from muslin. USA produces muslin for even jam making. So a lot of people do different things. Even Bangladesh has got different forms of muslin. None of these are pure. But there are certain fabrics produced in India and in Bangladesh by us, okay, which are closest to muslin. I have one variety here, if I may show it.
Sure, sure. Could we focus on this this muslin product? Is this a sari?
This is a sari. And do you mind actually holding one of the ends of it?
Sure. Why not?
Now, this particular sari was produced by us, and I would suggest that this is the only example in today's world of a 400 count, 400 count sari, which has been produced in the design of a classic muslin sari. So these motifs were not chosen by us. These motifs are the motifs of the old, which we have taken from the museums, and then reproduced it on our looms using the weavers of Bangladesh, special weavers.
Was it near somewhere in Narayanganj? Or
Absolutely right, yes, Roopganj, Narayanganj. And out of the weavers over there, we worked with them for almost about 16 to 18 months, and they went from what they normally do in Jamdani is a 60, 80 count. They went up to 150, 200, 250, where we broke the barrier, 300, which we showed earlier, and this is the only example of a 400 count.
Oh my goodness.
So it's very, very light. Now, this sort of product, I would be willing to say, is rubbing shoulders with the muslin of the old.
Right.
Okay. Our job now is to try and take it even higher, and we are attempting to break the 500, try and reach the 500 that we are working on, the 500 count, and using motifs on it. Now, in India, they produce plain, they don't produce motifs. But true muslin, that of the Mughals and so on like that, royalty would be with motifs. And that is the beauty of this particular product.
Now, what will be the price of something like this?
I have been asked that question, and I've always said this is not on sale.
Priceless.
But all I can say is that it would be something that would have taken a weaver in the region of about close to a year to produce this one. Okay.
Quickly, can you give me the price before we go to break?
Oh, certainly. I mean, the prices of these are in the region of about let's say 5,000 pounds.
Okay.
That's the prices of
Well, that's
this.
very. When we come back, we will try to sell it to you.